Hello, my name is Eli Lopez, and today we are launching the Legacy Podcast, which will be a series produced by Christian Life College. And on this first episode, I'm going to start by asking a simple question. What are you thinking about today? That's it. That's the question. What are you thinking about today? You see, the human mind is powerful. We have the ability to be creative, to discover, to invent. God has given humans the ability to reason, to use our mind for wholesome and productive purposes. But one thing is needed for our minds to be productive. We need to be focused. However, it's hard to be focused when the world around us just feels absolutely turned upside down from what we normally know. You see, today, much of our country is still in some sort of lockdown because of COVID-19. There have been so many who have contracted this disease, this virus. I was looking at the numbers today in the United States, over 2 million infected, and we've had about 115,000 deaths in the United States. In the world, there's over 7 million that have been infected and over 400,000 deaths. That's significant. It's heartbreaking. It's frustrating to watch this unfold. And I know so many people just feel powerless as we're just watching this happen to our nation and to our world. And it's not just the sickness, the disease. There's people's livelihoods now are affected. Lost wages, lost jobs. For a lot of homes here in the United States, despair is setting in, hopelessness is setting in, wondering how are we going to survive without income. And now, if you've been paying attention to the news, our country, our society is in the throes of confronting the evils of racism. And while that important conversation is taking place, there are those who are taking advantage of this situation and they're being aggressively destructive. They're pushing for lawlessness to prevail. And if you're anything like me, it can feel overwhelming. It feels overwhelming. We can feel powerless to fix what is wrong with this world, to fix what is wrong with our nation. Unless, as believers, we remember what we've known all along. You see, it's a song we've sung at church how many times? We know it's true. But we have to remind ourselves of it today. And this is what we know already. We know that Jesus is the answer for our world. Jesus is the answer for the United States. Jesus is the answer for every community in this nation. Jesus is the answer. And as believers, we have to keep our focus. We have to keep our eyes on Him. And sometimes that's easier said than done. And I was reading this week and I came across Colossians Chapter 3, and it reminded me again of this battle to keep our attention where it's supposed to be. This is what Paul wrote. He said, "If then you were raised with Christ, seek those things which are above, where Christ is, sitting at the right hand of God." Verse 2, set your mind, your thoughts on things above, not on things on the earth. For you died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is our life, appears, then you also will appear with Him in glory. If I could just wrap this up, those few verses, what's it saying? It's saying we have a spiritual perspective that we're supposed to have. This world is not our home. Heaven is our home. There's a glory that we're reaching for. So our thoughts, our focus, our attention needs to be on Jesus. I want to read those verses the way that Eugene Peterson rendered them. And Eugene Peterson, he gave a rendering of this passage, and just consider what it says. He said, "So if you're serious about living this new resurrection life with Christ, act like it. Pursue the things over which Christ presides. Don't shuffle along, eyes to the ground, absorbed with the things right in front of you. Look up and be alert to what is going on around Christ. That's where the action is. See things from His perspective. Your old life is dead. Your new life, which is your real life, even though invisible to spectators, is with Christ in God. He is your life. When Christ, your real life, remember, shows up again on this earth, you'll show up too. The real you, the glorious you. I just love the way he put that because it's a reminder that we're all living for a world, for a life beyond this life. And no matter how bad things may get down here, this world is not our home. I was listening to my pastor, Pastor Haney, preach last Sunday, and he said something so interesting. And I'm sure everyone who listened to the message, the sermon, probably had a similar thought that I had. He talked about how he stopped reading the news so he could maintain his focus on God. And he said it had been several weeks since he'd got on the internet and watched the news and got really updated on what's going on. And he said he did that because he had to remain sensitive to the voice of the Spirit. So he had to shut out the loud voices that were screaming for his attention and all the media out there. And I heard that, and it convicted me. It challenged me because here I am in my role in the college, and I'm paying attention to everything going on because maybe it'll have a direct impact on our campus. Maybe it'll have a direct impact on decisions that we have to make. So I've been just being caught up with all of the news and all of the updates and everything happening. And I heard this man of God say, I would rather be in tune with God than with the news cycle. And it convicted me. Now, I'm a teacher. I'm a researcher. And so not only do I work as an administrator at the college, I also teach several classes. And being a researcher, that Brother Haney's statement put me on a journey. And I started researching, is listening to the news bad? Is it a negative? And I came across a book by a Swiss researcher, Dr. Rolf Dobelli, and he wrote a book, The Art of Thinking Clearly, Better Thinking, Better Decisions. It was written back in 2013, and you can buy it on, on Amazon, different bookstores. And I got to working through some of his research and some of his conclusions. And I can't give you, there's so much content. I'm going to give you a couple snapshots. This is what he says. Now, it's his opinion that we shouldn't listen to the news. This is a secular researcher. And he says, don't listen to the news, don't read the news, don't watch the news. And he's going to give some reasons why. I'm going to give some direct quotes here. One direct quote is, news is irrelevant. And it's written, out of the approximately 10,000 news stories you have read in the last 12 months, name one that because you consumed it allowed you to make a better decision about a serious matter affecting your life, your career, or your business. He says, really, for the quality of life, news is irrelevant. It doesn't give you the tools to make better decisions. So you're filling your time with things that aren't helping you make better choices. That's just one of his points. Another point, he said, news is toxic to your body. It constantly triggers the limbic system. Panicky stories spur the release of cascades of cortisol. This deregulates your immune system and inhibits the release of growth hormones. In other words, your body finds itself in a state of chronic stress. High cortisol levels cause impaired digestion, lack of growth, cell, hair, or bone, those areas are affected, nervousness, and susceptibility to infections. This is what reading, watching, ingesting the news does to your body in a physical manner. It's toxic. I'm skipping over some of his points. And another point that he said, news inhibits thinking. Thinking requires concentration. Concentration requires uninterrupted time. News pieces are specifically engineered to interrupt you. They are like viruses that steal attention for their own purposes. News makes us shallow thinkers. This researcher, these are the conclusions that he's coming to as he's studying the effects of people as they read and watch the news. He goes on, he says, online news has an even worse impact. In a 2001 study, 2 scholars in Canada showed that comprehension declines as the number of hyperlinks in a document increases. Why? Because whenever a link appears, your brain has to at least make the choice not to click, which in itself is distracting. News is an intentional interruption system. He said, actually, news degrades your ability to think and to think deeply. He goes on, another point that he makes. News works like a drug. As stories develop, we want to know how they continue. With hundreds of arbitrary storylines in our heads, this craving is increasingly compelling and hard to ignore. Reading the news becomes like a drug. You want to know. It pulls you in. It takes you deeper. Another point, he says, news wastes time. If you read the newspaper for 15 minutes each morning and then check the news for 15 minutes during lunch and 15 minutes before you go to bed, and then add 5 minutes here and there when you're at work, then count distraction and refocusing time, you will lose at least half a day every week. Information is no longer a scarce commodity, but attention is. You are not that irresponsible with your money, reputation, or health. Why give away your mind? When I read that, I didn't know how to respond. He says, you are giving away your precious time by feeding it all of these news stories that don't bring any positive impact to your life. Let's go on just a few more. He says, news makes us passive. News stories are overwhelmingly about things you cannot influence. The daily repetition of news about things we can't act upon makes us passive. It grinds us down until we adopt a worldview that is pessimistic, desensitized, sarcastic, and fatalistic. The scientific term is learned helplessness. That's what happens when you consume the news all the time. And finally, the last point of his that I want to share with you, he says, news kills creativity. Remember what I said at the beginning, how God has given us this powerful tool called the mind. We can be so creative. We have the ability to reason. We can invent incredible things as human beings. But he says news kills creativity. And he makes this point. He said, I don't know a single truly creative mind who is a news junkie. Not a writer, not a composer, mathematician, physician, scientist, musician, designer, architect, or painter. On the other hand, I know a bunch of viciously uncreative minds who consume news like drugs. So when Pastor Haney made that comment as he's preaching the Sunday morning sermon at Christian Life Center, I was convicted. And then I did the research and reading what this doctor from Switzerland, Dr. Dobelli, what he came up with, it made me realize that how the Spirit of God was leading my pastor is in line, absolutely in line with the scientific research that shows the negative impacts of having these negative voices bombarding our minds all the time. And what did Paul say? He said, set your mind on things above. Set your mind on things above. Another verse I want to share with you real quick is Romans 13:11 and into verse 12. Paul said, and do this, knowing the time. I've had a lot of Christians ask me, well, what do I think about COVID-19? What do I think about what's happening in society? And all I have to say is we have to be aware of the times that we're living in. Do this, knowing the time. Now, I'm not talking about time in the natural sense, but in the spiritual sense. This is an important time for the church. It's an important time for the people of God. We've got to be awake and we've got to be aware. And do this, knowing the time, that now it is high time to awake out of sleep. For now our salvation is nearer than when we first believe. Paul said, you've got to realize there's a heaven to reach for. God's going to wrap this thing up, and we don't have time to be distracted chasing things that don't matter. Now our salvation is nearer than when we first believed. The night is far spent. The day is at hand. We must be aware of the time, and we must have a spiritual focus. Ephesians 5, again, I'm reading a lot of what Paul wrote today. In Ephesians 5, Paul said, see then that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise. To walk circumspectly means like to walk gingerly or to walk very carefully. He says, walk very carefully, not as a foolish person, but as a wise person. And he said, redeeming the time. To redeem is to buy something back. We're all given the same amount of time. We all have 24 hours in the day. What are you going to do with the time that you're given? Paul said you need to redeem the time. You need to make the most of the time that you have, redeeming the time. Why? Because the days are evil. Paul could have written that today, but he wrote it about 2,000 years ago. And Paul was facing some evil times, and he wrote to the Christians in those days. He said, you need to walk carefully. You need to walk in wisdom. You need to make the best use of your time. Why? Because the days are evil. He said, therefore, do not be unwise, but understand what the will of the Lord is. And that's what my pastor was striving to do, to be in tune with the voice of God, with the Spirit of God, to be in tune with the Word of God. That is not just for a pastor. That's for every believer. We need to be in tune with God. Understand what the will of the Lord is. And do not be drunk with wine. You can't drink your problems away. Drugs isn't going to solve anything. Do not be drunk with wine, which is dissipation, or which is filled with waste, which leads to destruction. Don't chase after that. He said, but be filled with the Spirit. It's going to be a sad occasion for us to come out of this COVID-19 shutdown. And I have a feeling that many Christians would not have redeemed the time. And instead of developing a walk with God, a prayer life, a focus, instead of making the most of the extra time that they had, they're going to squander that, binging on media, chasing after things that don't really matter. And the Bible tells us to redeem the time. We should come through this, and we should be in a more spiritual state than we've ever been. And if there's college students listening to this podcast, don't waste one day, but remember your Creator in the days of your youth. In this season of life, plug into God. I met with a young man about 3 days ago, and he's working full-time this summer and trying to get some bills paid off. And I asked him, I respect his work ethic so much. I asked him, I said, but how's your prayer life doing? How's you and Jesus? And he said, I'm waking up every morning, I'm going to prayer. He's redeeming the time. He's not wasting this season, this moment. So I want to challenge you. What are you thinking about today? What is your attention on today? Can you hear the voice of the Spirit as it's speaking to the church today? Can God speak to you out of His Word and give you clear direction? What are you thinking about today? Because what did Paul say? He said, set your mind on things above, not on things on the earth. I know it's tempting to be caught up in everything going around us. I'm fighting that exact same temptation as you. But I've got to come back and reclaim a spiritual focus. Set your mind on things above, not on things on this earth. This is Eli Lopez. Thank you for joining me today for Christian Life College's Legacy Podcast.